Hey Cameron, it's Wednesday. Thought we could have our Bible study today. And for today's lesson, I thought it might be appropriate if we talked about a story that I think we've all heard, but we haven't probably read in a while. And that is the Battle of Jericho. And this is, of course, the point in the history of Israel when the Hebrew people have kind of emerged from the wilderness after 40 years. And as we know, Moses led them out of Egypt and was their leader for the vast majority of the time when they were in the wilderness. But Moses dies there. And we will find out later in the book of Jude, of course, that St. Michael the Archangel and the devil actually fought for the soul of Moses. Joshua emerges as sort of the leader of the people of Israel. And in many ways, he's kind of Moses' protege, and the story has him leading them through some episodes, almost a miniature version of Exodus. They cross the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, and the Jordan kind of opens for them like the Red Sea had 40 years earlier. And we come to this bit in chapter 5 where it says in verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The Canaanites still occupied Jericho at this time. And he said, "No, rather I indeed come now as a captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place you are standing on is holy." And Joshua did so. And that, of course, should remind us of Moses' sort of initial encounter with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his forefathers, at the burning bush, that Moses had been instructed to remove his sandals, for he was on holy ground at that time. So what the scripture's doing here, and again, we're not here to challenge the veracity of the account, okay? We're not here to say that these things did not occur. We take them on faith that they occurred, but how they're recorded, okay, how the story is written is important. And we want to look at the form of the literature, right? So form criticism, literary criticism, and I don't mean criticism in like we're going to make fun of it or pick at it. I mean in an academic sense, to evaluate the literature, to take it apart and look at it in those categories of the form of the literature and of the literature. We can see here that what the story is trying to do, the way the writer recorded it, what the writer's trying to do here is to demonstrate that Joshua has been ordained or selected by God to succeed Moses as the rightful leader. And so the way that's being done is that Joshua is being shown to be the leader selected by God by divine right, okay? He leads them through the waters of the Jordan, just like Moses led the people through the Red Sea. He has this encounter with an angel, and the angel instructs him to take off his sandals on holy ground, just as Moses was instructed at the burning bush. So that parity of experience is being demonstrated by the writer in an effort to prove to the reader that Joshua maybe isn't quite Moses. He's in QM, not quite Moses, right? But still, he is the ordained leader by divine selection. But we come, and it says Joshua did so. He took off his sandals. Now we go to chapter 6. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. In other words, the Canaanites in Jericho had heard that they had crossed the Jordan. They knew the Israelites were coming. They shut the city up, had high walls. No one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hands with its king and the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all the men of the war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. And the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead." So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpet of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And then he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And it was so, that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. And the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark went on continually and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. Then it came about on the 7th day that they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. And it came about at the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, and the city shall be under the ban. It and all that is in it belong to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, lest you covet them and take some of the things under the ban, so you would make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and priests blew the trumpets, and it came about, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Of course, they go forth and rescue Rahab, who will play an important role in the history of Israel in her own right. This story is, I think, very interesting. And we have to, I think, consider it, especially in these times. Now, I am one who does not believe in trying to interpose current politics onto the text in a way that is disingenuous or a practice of bad exegesis. That isn't helpful. The scriptures teach what they teach, and we have to draw lessons and morals and spiritual guidance from those lessons. We have to learn from their example, but you can't simply read modernity onto these ancient texts. That is an act of anachronism, which is intellectually indefensible, academically bush league, and quite honestly, just bad practice. It's not fair to the Bible. It's not fair to modernity. But I do think that we have to draw some clear comparisons and some contrasts. When we as Americans living in the 21st century read the Bible, and this is the way it's been done for us, we always, especially we Christians, I mean, that's who's reading the Bible, we read it as though we are the Israelites when we read the Old Testament, right? We see ourselves, and certainly rightly so, as the people of God in modernity. We're the church. And so we read the history of the people of God and put ourselves into their shoes. I mean, I would like to believe, and I think most of us would like to believe, that if it was Joshua and the Israelites, we would be with Joshua and the Israelites. We're a part of the people of God. It would be tough for me to give up the bacon and the shrimp, but if we had a time machine, I'd like to be a part of God's people. But we also need to understand, and I think this is increasingly true and unfortunate, that America as a nation is not really in the same position of the Israelites, especially early on as a fledgling nation, guided by theological conviction. We are much more comparable to the dominant empires in the stories. If it's Moses and the Israelites trying to escape Egypt, which is America more like? Moses or Pharaoh? And that is an uncomfortable question that I grapple with, because in terms of position and power, America would be much more comparable to Egypt than we would be to the Israelites in a lot of ways. Similarly, in this situation, who are we more like? The Canaanites in their walled city, or the Israelites who are trying to take the city? And we're really much more in a position kind of like, I think, the Canaanites as the America as an empire. It's important when we read the text, the theologians and the scriptural scholars always say, we have to locate ourselves in this story. And I, of course, as a Christian, and as one who is, I've been taught the Bible since I was very small, I want to locate myself with the people of God. I want to read myself and identify with Joshua and the Israelites. But in terms of reality and how and the position that we're in as a people and as a nation, it's much easier to sort of to trace our reality onto the position of the Canaanites here than that of the Israelites here. And we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep that in mind, that as powerful as America is in the world, and as we become increasingly, and I would say very unfortunately, less and less decidedly Christian, and even less and less Judeo-Christian in a broad sense in our morals and sensibilities, that we need to recognize that, especially as we approach the Gospels, we have far less in common with Jesus and the Jews, and we have far more in common with Pilate and the Romans. And that is an uncomfortable thought, but it should give us pause. That's not to chastise America, but it is to say that we as Christians in America need to read our Bibles with a certain dose of humility and not just assume that we're always the good guy in the story. There may be room for chastening and being held accountable for our place in the world and how we conduct ourselves and the assumptions we make about the nature of the way the world is. Regardless, let's go to this story today. Now, basically we know this story, but Joshua is the kind of the new leader of the Israelites, and he's starting to give orders, and he receives word from the Lord. I love how it's verse 1. Now Jericho was tightly shut. No one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with his king and all the valiant warriors." I just love that, because I'm sure Joshua was looking at the city, which is completely locked down. I mean, they got the windows barricaded, they got the doors closed, they're filling up the moat, whatever they're doing. You know, they're getting all they've gone into high alert lockdown here. And the Lord's going, "See, Joshua, I have given you the city." And Joshua's going, "It does not look like you have gift wrapped it very well, Lord. I mean, this does not look like you've given me the city. This looks like we're going to have a fight." And God gives him his orders. He says, "You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days." That's important. So he says, you're going to take your men of war, you're going to take your soldiers, they're going to march, right? Once time around the city, every day for 6 days. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. So not only are you taking your men of war, you are taking the priests, and you are taking the ark, which means that God himself, who sits on the mercy seat, who sits on top of that ark, God himself, invisible to the human eye, but present, is marching with them. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is this sort of fabled, legendary, mysterious, wonderful, fantastic, holy artifact. And for more information and a more detailed account of the Ark, I highly recommend the 1981 documentary that focuses on the work of Dr. Henry Jones Jr. entitled Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's Indiana Jones. That's my favorite. It's my favorite movie. We watch it every year on my birthday. My favorite movie. It is one of the first movies that I remember watching at home with my dad. He had an old Betamax videotape player, and we only had like 4 movies or whatever on Betamax, but he and I used to watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I remember it because it was a great movie, but I think I have such fond memories of it partly because I remember watching it with Dad. And Dad loved that scene, you know, when the guy in the streets of Cairo, when the big guy in black comes out with his sword and he does all the fancy sword stuff, and Indiana Jones is so tired from fighting, he just pulls out his gun and shoots that guy. He's not going to get in a sword fight with that guy, he just shoots him. And my dad laughs every time. It's his favorite scene. But that movie and it gets a few of the biblical details incorrect. It's a movie. But it certainly impressed upon me the importance of the ark when it does appear in Scripture. And where the ark is, the very literal presence of God is there. It's the same God who was up on Mount Sinai. So there are, in fact, stories told that people were not allowed to touch the ark. You could not touch it or you would die. And of course, there's a story just before this that as they were crossing a river, they had these poles, and the priests would carry, 4 priests, one on each pole, and they would carry the ark. And as they were crossing, one of the priests slipped, and the ark was falling. And so one of them went to catch the ark, and for touching the ark, he was struck dead. And readers of this say, oh, that was terribly cruel. Why would the Lord kill that man? Well, they had been told not to touch the ark. And it wasn't that God was punishing so much as God was sitting on that ark. This is the same as Sinai. Humanity cannot get close to the holiness, power, and majesty of God will strike you dead because it is simply too much for a human being to encounter. It says that Moses, when he would go up to the mountain and he would be dealing with God directly, that his face from being in the presence of God shone so brightly that when he came down from the mountain, he would have to wear a veil over his face because the people couldn't stand to look at him. The raw power of God is simply too much for a human being to deal with directly. And of course, that leads us to the necessity and the great power of Jesus in the incarnation, that by becoming a human being, the second person of the Trinity the Word of God becomes flesh. He is able to mediate that people can touch Jesus. They can touch God in God's humanity. And that mediating that vast difference between God and humanity, the incarnation itself is miraculous. So that's a huge point. But a bit of a tangent. But it is important that when Israel goes to war against Jericho, against the Canaanites, they're not fighting. They are marching. They are marching, and they are carrying the ark with them and the priests with them, with their horns. So it is not to say that, oh, you're going to fight your way through the Canaanites and the walls of Jericho. No. You're going to be there. You're going to be present. But God will do the fighting. Okay? And of course, they march for 6 days. And then on that 7th day, it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead. These people, the Israelite people, coming into Jericho, coming against the Canaanites who occupy them, because God has promised this land to Abraham's descendants. Quite sure that the Canaanites either didn't know that or wouldn't have agreed with it. They felt like it was their land, and it had been for quite some time. That's a tough one. It's a tough one. First of all, it's not fair to just make crazy comparisons to say, for example, oh, well, we could easily map this story onto our modern problem of, or modern issue, I should say, of immigration and undocumented immigration. You know, those people are coming from another land, those people are crossing a river, and those people are just in search of, you know, whatever. That's not the same. Merely being an undocumented person does not necessarily make one the people of God, in the same sense that the Israelites were the people of God. But there is a certain sense in which Christians are called to hospitality, as were the Jews later on. People in need, people who are seeking a home, seeking safety and asylum and a brighter future. What is the proper response to that? Not that issues like national security aren't important. They certainly are. But how do you do both? How do you find a way to keep our own nation safe while at the same time trying to embrace the Judeo-Christian call towards hospitality and the care for strangers, to be good Samaritans to those in need, even though they're maybe not like us completely? But trying to map that on in ways that ignore the incongruities of the situations is not good theology or good exegesis. We could also look at, it would be unfair to say that the situation currently with the protests and the riots that are taking place map on directly. Oh, here come the people of God, the Israelites, and they are marching around a city. They are marching and blaring their horns, and they are, you know, here to oppose this walled empire. And, you know, just because a group is marching for a political cause does not automatically make them the same as the people of God coming out of the wilderness. On the other hand, if they are genuine in their motives to make us a more perfect union, to try to stand up and raise their voices for greater justice and greater equality, then I think we as Christians have to acknowledge that those are social virtues that we also have to endorse. We as United Methodists and we as Christians should always oppose racism in every form and on all sides. We should seek to live as Americans in a more just and equal society. You know, we have to constantly strive to be a more perfect union, to be better. But there are questions then of what constitutes better. Better according to whom? Better in a Judeo-Christian or explicitly Christian value system, or better according to the world's definition of equality and social justice? Because those can be very, very different ideas. What is good and fair to the Christian may be poisonous to the world. The same is in the same way, what the world says is good and fair may be in fact sinful to the Christian sensibility. So that we have to be very, very careful. However, I do think what we can glean from this story is the necessity of when we go to oppose a physical and even political entity. And Jericho, the city of Jericho, is certainly that. It is a physical wall. It is a separate people and kingdom. It is a political entity. It is a military entity. It is a physical entity with a physical barrier, a very famous wall. When we go to oppose that, God instructs Joshua to do so with two specifically groups of people: the men of war and the priests. So that's sort of a practical and spiritual approach. I mean, this is the answer that God gives us, is that when the people of God are called to oppose an entity of this world, a worldly power that is both physical and practical and governmental, that we do have to have some practicality. Bring the men of war. Bring your soldiers, Joshua. But don't forget the priests. And take with you the Ark of the Covenant. And you're not going to fight, you're not going to lace it. I mean, and here's some basic battle tactics. The Israelites had no way of taking Jericho militarily. Not according to what we have here in Scripture. They had no trebuchets or catapults. They had no real weapons of siege. They were not supplied for a long-term siege of a walled city. They really had no way of laying siege other than to try and starve them out, which would have taken months. And I don't know that the Israelites had the logistical support to have sustained that kind of a campaign. So for Joshua to have approached this in a strictly military strategy would have been unsuccessful, would have been impossible. But God does not tell him just send the priests. He does not just take this in a spiritual way. And I think there's a lesson there, right? When we're dealing with the world, we have to have some measure of practicality in that. When we're dealing with a political problem, we have to engage the world, and if we're going to be any earthly good, we have to be able to offer some practical solutions. The old adage, some Christians are so heavenly minded that they are no earthly good. And yet the church has to very, very trepidatious when it enters into politics. I mean, when the church speaks into a political situation or on a political issue, you are on dangerous territory. Because, with great humility is required the church, by its very nature, when it speaks as the church, is declaring that they're speaking for God on a specific issue. That is tough. That is tough. What is the will of God on any issue is not always black and white clear. So hard to draw. I'm not here to speak today about the issue of immigration, or in particular even undocumented immigration, because it's not a one-to-one analogy with this story. There are important incongruities with those situations, and time, place, politics, the people involved, all of that. Nor does this story track directly onto the current situation with protests and in some cases the riots that are plaguing our cities. Let me say this, if I may. I will draw these parallels that what the Israelites are instructed to do by God here is to march around the city with their soldiers and their priests, and to let the Canaanites know that they are there. They don't say a word. In fact, Joshua tells them not to say a word. But they march, and they make their presence known. And they make their opposition to the Canaanites and the city perfectly clear. In America, we have the right to peacefully assemble and to peacefully protest. And I thank God for that right. Because there may come a day when Christians are in such a minority that we need to exercise that right to protest, to simply make the gospel heard. And we will want the protection of the Constitution to ensure that our free speech and our right to speak freely about the gospel remains free. So when people protest, even when I disagree strongly, they absolutely have a right to protest. Most of the protests that I have seen in person in my area have obviously been concerned with racial inequality and the injustice surrounding the murder of Mr. Floyd, George Floyd, and others who have tragically died in police custody. All these cases of which, many cases, are tragic. No one should die in police custody. And we as a society and we as Christians should oppose injustice in every form, regardless of who's involved. That's true. And so for these protesters who are standing up for those issues, who are speaking truth to the power of the system, right, who are not violent, who are not creating a ruckus. In fact, as I've driven by many protesters here in Fairfax or in Burke or in my area, in Chantilly, they have waved, they've smiled, they've held up their signs. All of their messages were signs I could certainly affirm. I'm terribly sorry about what happened to Mr. Floyd. I think that from the video evidence that has been publicly shown, it was a terrible, terrible thing to have happened. And I hope the courts will investigate and that the officers involved will be dealt with justly. It certainly seems like punishment would be warranted. It certainly seems like a crime was committed. And so if that's the case, I hope justice is carried out and swiftly. But this idea of looting and rioting, that is not at all what Joshua is instructed to do. In fact, God tells him that they're not to take the spoils of the Canaanites, and that any gold or silver or any of the valuables are to be put into the Lord's treasury. They're not to go looting and stealing. That this battle will be won by God. God is giving the city to the Israelites, and they are not to go in there and loot. And so, I'm sure most reasonable people would agree that looting and stealing and pillaging is not an acceptable thing to do, even in the face of, it's not acceptable for Christians. I don't really think it's acceptable in a civilized society, but again, those are kind of Judeo-Christian morals of Western civilization. I also think that it distracts. If someone is looting and pillaging, it's hard to take their moral lessons seriously. So I absolutely want to affirm those persons who are concerned about justice and racism and inequality in our society. They have a right to speak up. I'm glad that they're speaking up. We should all be concerned about those issues. And I have to acknowledge that my experience as an American has been fairly on the level. But I at my elementary school and my middle school and my high school, though in different locations. I was in elementary school in Hawaii and in Florida. I was in middle school in Alabama and in Mississippi, and I went to high school in Mississippi. And in all of those schools, white people were in the minority. In my elementary school, from 2nd through 6th grade, 5 years there in Hawaii, Caucasians made up 7% of that school. And in my middle school, in high school in Mississippi, Caucasians made up about 20%. I think that was right. 20% of my class was Caucasian. And I'll tell you what I learned by being the minority, even though being a white minority is different. And I acknowledge that. But I'll tell you what I learned about being in the minority. People called me names sometimes. In Hawaii, it was haole is the word, for kind of a derogatory term for whites from the mainland. And I was called names in high school that were sometimes racial in nature. But what I found is that in all of those situations, what matters is how a person conducts oneself. If I treated people respectfully and fairly, and they would treat me respectfully and fairly in return, we got along just fine. In Hawaii, especially in Hawaii, I had friends who were of every race under the sun. Hawaii is kind of a wonderful melting pot that way. And just to prove that I got treated pretty fairly, in my last year there in the 6th grade, I was elected student body president of the whole school. So, it was a wonderful learning experience for me about the nature of race. And race relations are different across the country. The way it works in the Deep South is different than the way it works here in Virginia or in North Carolina. Certainly different than the way it works in Hawaii. But there are good people everywhere. We as a people who are motivated by following the cross should care for all of our brothers and sisters. But the way that we stand up for the cause of Jesus is again, I think there's a lesson here. We have to be practical. Joshua is instructed to take his men of war. This is a siege, after all. But it also has to be directed by God, and we have to take God with us. And his presence with us is absolutely essential. It is the key component to our success. So if we're going to stand up for the cause of Jesus, even in the political sphere, we better make sure we're taking God with us and that we're paying attention and letting him fight the battles. Remember that when we put on the armor of God, Paul says clearly that our mission is to stand. The church's job is to stand and let God do his thing. We hold the line. We're not there to be the offensive force. Okay. I say all this to say this, that and sometimes good Christians disagree. And that's unfortunate on politics. I wish it weren't that way. There have been some issues back home in Mississippi that the state is wrestling with right now, about which I have had difficulties and arguments with old friends with. And that's a shame. It's a shame that we can't agree. And I could be wrong on some of these issues, okay? That's part of, I think, my conviction as a Christian is the requirement of humility. I have to realize that I could be wrong, okay? But I also, when I do oppose my friends or people that I love on any of these issues, I have to recognize that even if they're wrong, they're still good people. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt that they are even if they're wrong, they're doing so. They might be wrong for the best of intentions. They might be wrong with the best of motives. They're trying their best to figure out a way to love Jesus, to love their neighbor, and negotiate all the pitfalls of a sinful world. And that is a hard thing to do. That is a hard thing to do. And unfortunately, we don't have an Ark of the Covenant to carry around with us to help us get it right all the time. So until we find that warehouse where Dr. Jones put the Ark of the Covenant, let's treat each other, even in our disagreements, with humility and compassion, especially among fellow Christians. When I disagree with another Christian, and I'll be honest, even when I think they're an idiot, I still need to remember that I have to love them and that I have to try to give them the benefit of the doubt. Doesn't make me right, doesn't make them right, but I think the least we can do is treat each other well and try to love on each other. So, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. God fought the battle of Jericho. And so this week I want you to think, whatever battles you may feel like you're in, whatever conflicts, maybe you've been in conflict with family members or friends, or Facebook looks like a battlefield sometimes. Remember to love your neighbor. Remember to love your enemies. And let God do the fighting for you. Focus on being a faithful instrument of God's will. And He will fight our battles for us. Have a great week.